General Hospital will reveal exciting news on Monday, May 12, 2025. First, Lulu couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that had been haunting her every time she observed the connection between Lois and Gio. It wasn't just maternal affection. Not just familial protectiveness, it was something deeper, something more primal. Her instincts, sharpened by loss and trauma, were screaming that something wasn't right. As she silently watched the interactions between them, a creeping suspicion began to take root. There was something too careful, too measured about the way Lois hovered near Gio. Especially during emotional moments. Lulu had no evidence, only a growing belief that a long-buried secret might be hiding behind those protective glances and awkward silences. Unable to let it go, Lulu began a quiet investigation. She combed through hospital archives, old adoption records, and any document from the period when she was in a coma. Her mind kept returning to that gap in time, when decisions could have been made on her behalf without her consent. The more she dug, the more inconsistencies she found: a missing birth record, a sealed adoption file with a redacted maternal identity, and a vague notation about a baby boy born during her hospitalization. A sense of dread wrapped around her as each puzzle piece brought her closer to a terrifying truth she wasn't ready to face. But it was too late to turn back. The shadows of the past were stirring. And she was determined to walk straight into them. The breakthrough came when Lulu found an old photograph hidden in Brooke Lynn's filing cabinet, one that clearly showed Brooke Lynn cradling a newborn with Joe's unmistakable eyes and features. The resemblance was undeniable. Lulu's breath caught in her chest. It was more than suspicion now, it was confirmation. That child couldn't have been anyone else but Gio. But if Brooke Lynn wasn't the biological mother, then whose baby had been given away and passed off as hers? The timeline added up far too precisely. Lulu realized with horror that the child might have been hers. She had gone into a coma pregnant, only to wake up and be told there was no baby. What if that was a lie? Her confrontation with Brooke Lynn was devastating. Backed into a corner with the photo and documents Lulu had uncovered, Brooke Lynn broke down. She admitted that Lois had made the decision to take the child, believing it was the safest option at the time, and convinced everyone to keep it a secret. She had been young, scared, and obeying her mother's desperate plea. The baby had been passed to Brooke Lynn to raise under the guise of a premature adoption. All to shield him from what Lois called an uncertain future due to Lulu's coma. Lulu felt the weight of betrayal crush her. She hadn't just lost time, she had lost years with her own son. When Dante learned the truth, his world unraveled. The idea that Gio, the son he had loved and raised without question, might have been his biological child all along was almost too much to process. The anger, the guilt, the sheer heartbreak of it all threatened to tear him apart. He remembered moments when he had wished Gio could have been his child, never knowing that wish had already come true. The deception, even if done with good intentions, had robbed him and Lulu of the chance to raise their son together. He couldn't decide whether to be furious with Lois or just broken over what could never be reclaimed. But it was Gio who took the news the hardest. Everything he had known about his life, the woman he called Ma, the family he believed in, was now tainted by lies. He disappeared for days, refusing to answer calls. Turning his back on those he had trusted. The identity crisis shattered him. Who was he, really? A Quartermain by upbringing, a Falconeri by blood, or someone entirely lost between two truths? He spiraled, caught between grief and rage, feeling as though his entire life had been a performance in a story someone else had written. Lulu tried to reach him. But every attempt was met with silence. The son she had finally found didn't want to be found. Lois, meanwhile, was left to face the public condemnation. Port Charles buzzed with scandal as the secret spilled into the press. Her reputation crumbled under the weight of her silence, but she refused to defend herself. She claimed everything she had done was out of love and necessity. At the time, she believed she was saving a child from a life of uncertainty. She insisted that no one could understand what it felt like to stand between a baby and a broken family with no answers. But her reasoning did little to soften the consequences. What had been hidden in the name of protection now stood in plain view as betrayal, and it was too late for explanations. In the aftermath, every relationship was strained. Lulu stood at the center of a whirlwind she hadn't asked for but could no longer escape. The truth had set her free, but it had also wrecked everything she thought she knew. Dante struggled to reconnect with a son who now viewed him as a stranger. Brooklyn isolated herself in shame. And Gio, the boy at the heart of it all, was left to decide whether to rebuild from the ruins or run from them. In time, wounds might begin to heal, but the scars left by this revelation would shape them forever. And as Lulu looked out over the city, she knew one thing with painful clarity: some secrets never stay buried, no matter how deep you try to hide them. Second, Jens Sidwell stood on the edge of a dangerous proposition, fully aware that aligning himself with Sunny could lead to explosive consequences. Still, he was a man who thrived in the shadows of power, manipulating narratives and dismantling reputations with surgical precision. Drew had become a growing threat in Port Charles, not just because of his expanding media empire, but because of his apparent alliance with Tracy, a woman known for pulling strings in silence. To Jens, this wasn't just a business opportunity. It was a strategic offensive designed to crush an emerging rival before he gained absolute control. And Sunny, bruised but still powerful, was the perfect partner for such a campaign. Sidwell's proposal was clear and cold-blooded: use media influence to expose Drew's dealings and sever his financial and political lifelines. The evidence Sidwell had compiled was damning: encrypted email correspondences, off-the-record conversations, and a detailed analysis of Drew's latest corporate acquisitions, many of which suspiciously aligned with Tracy's own investments. Jens had pieced together the foundation of a war plan. All he needed now was Sunny's approval. With each passing hour, Drew grew more entrenched in the public's favor, and Jens knew the window to act was narrowing fast. Sunny, however, wasn't the kind of man to be rushed. He was skeptical of Sidwell's motivations, and rightly so. Jens had a reputation for playing both sides, for turning on partners when it served his interest. But Sunny couldn't ignore the pattern forming before him. Drew, once a neutral player in the city's power grid, was now actively moving to undermine Sunny's relationships with donors, business leaders, and even legal allies. More alarming was the discovery that Tracy's fingerprints were all over these maneuvers, signaling a larger conspiracy that aimed not just to discredit Sunny, but to dismantle everything he had built. Despite his instincts screaming caution, Sunny felt the ground shifting beneath him. The pressure was mounting from every side: financial deals falling through, trusted allies becoming hesitant, whispers of scandals beginning to surface. The slow chokehold Drew and Tracy were applying was beginning to squeeze. Sunny wasn't one to rely on propaganda, but the media war had become unavoidable. For the first time in a long while, he was forced to consider using the same tactics his enemies thrived on: manipulation, exposure, and narrative control. Jens, meanwhile, waited patiently, knowing Sunny's silence wasn't a rejection but a calculation. Every delay meant Sunny was weighing the cost of war versus the cost of surrender. Jens knew this kind of hesitation often led to the most ruthless decisions. He didn't need Sunny to trust him, he just needed Sunny to recognize that doing nothing would be the beginning of his end. And when the moment came, Jens was prepared to unleash everything: strategically timed leaks, editorials, public opinion polling, all designed to paint Drew as a fraud propped up by backdoor deals and family name alone. Sunny eventually opened the dossier Jens had delivered, his expression unreadable. The details were too precise to ignore, the implications too serious to dismiss. Each document told a story of betrayal, greed, and ambition disguised as legacy. Sunny knew that if Drew succeeded, his own power in Port Charles would become ceremonial, reduced to whispers of a past dominance. And for a man who had clawed his way through fire to claim his place, surrender was not an option. The question wasn't if he would act, but how far he was willing to go. In the end, the choice to fight back would not come from anger, but from survival. Sidwell had planted the seed of war. And Sunny, despite every hesitation, knew it was time to answer the threat with force. What lay ahead was a storm neither Drew nor Tracy could fully predict. And as the first moves were set in motion, it became clear, this wouldn't just be a media war, it would be a reckoning. One built on exposure, destruction, and the cost of secrets long kept in the dark. Third, Willow found herself walking a path that increasingly isolated her from those she once considered close, particularly Nina, whose manipulations were becoming harder to ignore. Despite Nina's insistence that Drew needed to be held accountable for his recent actions, his erratic media tactics, his aggressive business decisions, and the enemies he had made along the way, Willow refused to align herself with that perspective. She had seen the toll this war had taken on Drew, both publicly and privately. And she believed there was more to the story than what met the eye. While Nina attempted to influence her daughter's opinion through emotional appeals and half-truths, Willow remained grounded in her own quiet search for answers. Nina's frustration grew steadily as she watched Willow not only dismiss her concerns but go so far as to actively defend Drew. It wasn't just emotional support, Willow had begun her own discreet investigation. Determined to uncover the identity of whoever had orchestrated the scandal that nearly ruined Drew, an incident involving allegations of solicitation tied to a supposed encounter with a sex worker. While the public had moved on, the whispers remained, and Willow sensed a deliberate smear campaign designed to discredit him in the eyes of the community. Her instincts told her that Drew had been set up, and that someone had gone to great lengths to ensure his downfall. The problem was that Willow was getting closer to the truth, and Nina knew it. Because behind the layers of deception and concern, Nina held a secret far more explosive than anyone could imagine. She had been the architect of the very trap now threatening to unravel. It was Nina who had arranged for Drew to be placed in a compromising situation, believing that a moment of humiliation would be enough to push him out of Sunny's circle and out of Willow's loyalty. But the plan had backfired. Drew hadn't crumbled, instead, he had become more cautious, more defiant. And now Willow was unknowingly unearthing the carefully buried evidence that could link everything back to Nina. As Willow's search deepened, so did Nina's desperation. She tried to deflect, to raise doubts, even to suggest that Drew might be manipulating Willow emotionally. But every attempt was met with calm resistance. Willow's demeanor remained respectful but distant. She no longer sought Nina's advice or welcomed her unannounced visits. Each day, Willow grew more confident that someone in her inner circle had betrayed both Drew and her trust. And she was determined to expose them, regardless of the consequences. What she didn't realize yet was just how close she was to blowing up the very foundation of her family. Nina's anxiety intensified when she intercepted a message on Willow's phone, an anonymous lead referencing security footage from the hotel on the night Drew's scandal broke. The mere existence of such footage was enough to send her into panic mode. If Willow got her hands on it, everything would come crashing down. Not only would Nina lose her already fragile relationship with her daughter, but she would also face the wrath of Sunny, who would never forgive such a calculated betrayal. The house of cards she had so meticulously built, her fragile truce with Sunny, her restored position in society, would collapse in an instant. Now caught in a tightening noose of her own making, Nina faced a horrifying dilemma: stop Willow before she could reach the truth, or confess everything and risk total destruction. Every choice carried danger. Every lie she had told was now a crack in the foundation threatening to split wide open. Willow, once a pawn in Nina's schemes, had become the most dangerous player on the board, not because she sought revenge, but because she simply wanted the truth. And in seeking it, she had unknowingly declared war on her own mother. What began as a quiet disagreement between mother and daughter was now spiraling into a full-blown crisis. Willow's loyalty to Drew had not only put her at odds with Nina, But it had also placed her in the crosshairs of a far more dangerous game of secrets, manipulation, and betrayal. Nina could only watch in horror as the walls closed in, praying that somehow Willow's trail would go cold before the truth ignited a scandal that none of them would survive. Finally, Trina had been holding on to a fragile hope that Kai's surgery would mark the beginning of his recovery, that the worst was finally behind them and better days were ahead. She had stayed by his side through the uncertainty, the hospital visits, the tense silences, and the quiet prayers. So when Kai stepped into the hallway for the first time after the procedure, offering her a soft smile, Trina's heart soared. For a fleeting moment, it felt like the nightmare was over. But the illusion shattered quickly. As she met his smile with her own, she noticed his eyes drift past her shoulder, unfocused and uneasy. His posture wavered. His legs trembled. And then came the barely perceptible wince that he tried so hard to mask. Kai had believed he could push through the pain, that mind would triumph over body, that he could at least give Trina the comfort of seeing him strong. But the reality was far crueler. Every step burned, every shift in weight brought agony he hadn't expected. He had underestimated the damage, overestimated his recovery. And now the hallway that seemed short moments ago stretched into a corridor of torment. He didn't want Trina to see him falter, but she saw everything. The tightness in his jaw. The subtle grip on the wall rail. The fear in his eyes. Her heart sank. Not out of pity, but out of rising fury, not at Kai, but at the system, the choices, and above all, at Drew. Trina had trusted Drew when he advocated for the surgical procedure, when he assured her it was the most promising option available. He had used his influence, his confidence, and his network of professionals to push the plan forward. But now, standing in front of Kai's trembling figure, all she saw was failure, avoidable, painful failure. Anger welled up in her chest, boiling over before she could contain it. Without saying a word to Kai, she turned on her heel and stormed through the hospital corridors, her pace quick and relentless. She wasn't just angry, she was betrayed. And someone needed to answer for it. When she found Drew in the medical wing's administrative office, she didn't hesitate. Her words were sharp, accusatory, and filled with a hurt that had been festering beneath the surface for far too long. She confronted him about his role in recommending the surgery. Demanded to know whether he had pushed the operation for reasons beyond Kai's well-being, and whether he had even fully understood the risks involved. Drew, caught off guard by the ferocity of her emotions, tried to explain, but Trina was not in the mood for justifications. She needed someone to blame. And Drew was the most accessible target in that moment of rage and helplessness. Back in the hallway, Kai could sense the shift in energy. He knew Trina well enough to recognize that her sudden departure wasn't casual. She was angry, and it was because of him. Guilt wrapped around his chest like a vice. He hated that he was the reason she was in pain, the reason her eyes had lost their light. And now, she was out there, confronting people, defending him, protecting him. While he couldn't even stand up straight without gritting his teeth. He had wanted to be her strength, but instead, he had become her burden. The realization hit him harder than the physical pain ever could. Kai's situation was now more precarious than ever. Not only was his body failing to respond the way he had hoped, but the emotional consequences were spiraling just as quickly. Trina's confrontation with Drew would have ripple effects, political, professional, and deeply personal. It would strain relationships, erode trust, and possibly isolate Kai further from the support network he so desperately needed. And the worst part was, there was nothing he could do to stop it. He was stuck, between healing and hurting, between hope and regret. As Trina walked away from her confrontation with Drew, her anger hadn't lessened. But beneath the fury was a deeper truth. She was terrified. Terrified that Kai might never fully recover, that she had believed in promises too good to be true, and that love alone might not be enough to carry them through what lay ahead. The hallway where Kai still waited now felt like a chasm, wide, painful, and full of questions neither of them knew how to answer.